My son's text made my blood run cold. I was standing in my kitchen, flour still dusting my hands from making his favorite chocolate chip cookies, when my phone buzzed. "Don't come to Dad's funeral tomorrow, it's family only." I read it 3 times, certain I was misunderstanding. After 45 years of marriage, after raising 3 children and building a life together, I wasn't considered family? My legs went weak, and I had to grip the counter to stay upright. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for what I discovered when I visited the morgue last night. The body in that cold drawer, the one labeled Richard Harrison, wasn't my husband. The face was wrong. The hands were wrong. Even the wedding ring was a cheap imitation of the one I'd placed on Richard's finger all those years ago. My husband wasn't dead. He was very much alive, and I knew exactly where to find him. Before we start, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. My name is Margaret Harrison, though most people call me Maggie. At 68 years old, I've lived what most would consider a full life. But you wouldn't know it from looking at my photo albums. In nearly every picture, I'm in the background, making sure everyone else shines. There I am, barely visible behind my son Michael's graduation cake that took me 3 days to perfect. There's my elbow in the corner of Sarah's wedding photos, adjusting her veil. You'll find my shadow falling across Richard's promotional photos for his construction company, because I was holding the reflector board while the professional photographer captured his success. I never minded being invisible. That's what love meant to me, being the foundation that others could build their dreams upon. When Richard started Harrison Construction with nothing but ambition and a borrowed hammer, I worked 18-hour days doing his books for free, my infant daughter sleeping in a drawer beside my desk because we couldn't afford a crib. When his mother Dorothy developed dementia, I quit my part-time teaching job to care for her full-time. For 7 years, I spoon-fed her, changed her, and held her hand through the long, confused nights, while Richard built his empire on the stability I provided at home. My friends at church call me Saint Margaret, and they shake their heads in wonder. "How do you do it all?" they ask. The truth is, I never saw it as extraordinary. My mother raised 9 children after my father died in the mines. She taught me that a woman's strength isn't measured in recognition, but in the thriving of those she loves. So I poured myself into my family like water into soil, invisible but essential. My hands tell the real story of my life. These fingers have sewn Halloween costumes until dawn, typed thousands of invoices for Richard's business, and held my children through every fever, heartbreak, and triumph. The wedding ring that's been on my left hand for 45 years has worn thin from decades of dishes, laundry, and hard work. I've never once taken it off, not even when my fingers swelled during pregnancy or when the arthritis made it painful, because that's what commitment looked like to me. Permanent, unwavering, unconditional. But standing in that morgue, staring at a stranger's face where my husband's should have been, I realized something. Sometimes being invisible means people forget you have eyes that see everything. Life at 1247 Maple Street had a rhythm as comfortable as your favorite sweater. Every morning at 6 a.m. sharp, my feet would find the same creaking floorboard by the bed, the one Richard always promised to fix, but never did. I'd slip on my worn terry cloth robe, a Mother's Day gift from 15 years ago, and pad downstairs to start the coffee maker. 2 scoops of Colombian dark roast for Richard, 1 scoop of vanilla hazelnut for me. The kitchen would fill with that rich aroma while I'd stand by the window, watching the cardinals visit the feeder I kept stocked with sunflower seeds. Richard would come down at 6:30, his hair still sticking up in the back where it pressed against his pillow. "Morning, beautiful," he'd mumble, even though we both knew I looked nothing like beautiful with my gray hair and curlers and yesterday's mascara smudged under my eyes. But after 45 years, he still said it, and I still smiled. He'd read the business section while I scrambled his eggs, over medium, never runny, with 2 pieces of wheat toast buttered all the way to the edges. We didn't need to talk much anymore. Comfortable silence had become our love language. Tuesdays and Thursdays were my days. Tuesday mornings, I volunteered at the Sacred Heart Food Bank with my friend Betty. We'd sort canned goods and chat about our grandchildren, her bad knee, my new banana bread recipe. The familiar rhythm of stacking cans and checking expiration dates gave structure to my week. Thursday afternoons belonged to my granddaughter Emma. At 4 years old, she was a whirlwind of sticky fingers and endless questions. We'd bake cookies, read picture books, and build pillow forts in the living room. She called me Gigi because Grandma had too many letters for her to pronounce when she was 2, and it stuck. Evenings followed their own sacred routine. Richard would arrive home at 5:45, loosening his tie as he walked through the door. I'd have dinner ready by 6:15, pot roast on Mondays, spaghetti on Wednesdays, fish on Fridays. We'd eat at the dining room table, not the kitchen counter, because Richard believed in maintaining standards. After dinner, he'd help me clear the table but never wash dishes. That was where his domestic contribution ended, and I'd long ago stopped expecting more. At 7:30, we'd settle into our matching recliners to watch Jeopardy! Richard would shout answers at the television, getting about half of them wrong but acting victorious regardless. Shakespeare, he'd yell, and when the answer was actually Dickens, he'd insist he said Dickens all along. During commercial breaks, he'd tell me about his day, the new contracts coming in, which subcontractor was causing problems, how his back was acting up again. Weekends brought family chaos. Michael would visit with his wife Jennifer and their 2 boys, filling the house with the sounds of video games and arguments over who got the last piece of pie. Sarah would call from Denver, where she'd moved for her husband's job, and we'd video chat while I cooked Sunday dinner. The house would smell like roast chicken and fresh bread, and Richard would fall asleep watching golf, his gentle snoring a familiar soundtrack to my afternoons. Before bed each night, Richard would kiss my forehead, his lips dry and familiar against my skin. "Another day conquered, Maggie," he'd say, the same words for 20 years. I'd smile and squeeze his hand, grateful for the predictable comfort of our life together. It wasn't passionate or exciting anymore, but it was ours, and it was enough. Or so I thought. The changes started so gradually that I almost missed them, like watching someone age day by day until suddenly you realize they've gone gray. It was a Thursday evening in early October when Richard first said he needed to work late. I just set his dinner plate on the table, herb-crusted salmon with asparagus, his favorite, when his phone rang. He looked at the screen, and something flickered across his face. Not quite guilt, not quite excitement, but something I hadn't seen in years. "Honey, I've got to head back to the office," he said, already standing, already reaching for his jacket. "Big emergency with the Riverside project." The salmon sat there growing cold as I watched him straighten his tie in the hallway mirror. Since when did construction emergencies require a straightened tie at 7 p.m.? But I nodded, wrapped his plate in foil, and kissed him goodbye like the dutiful wife I'd always been. That became the new pattern. 2, sometimes 3 nights a week, these urgent calls would come. Always during dinner, always requiring him to leave immediately. The construction business he'd been running for 30 years, the one he used to joke, ran itself, suddenly needed his constant attention. When I mentioned this to Betty during our Tuesday volunteering, she raised an eyebrow. "Richard's working late? Didn't he just hire that young project manager specifically so he could step back?" She was right. Just 2 months ago, Richard had brought on Marcus, a sharp 35-year-old who was supposed to handle all the day-to-day operations. Richard had been so excited about it, talking about golf trips and maybe finally taking that Alaskan cruise I'd been dreaming about. Now Marcus's name never came up, and when I asked about him, Richard would wave his hand dismissively. "He's doing fine, still learning the ropes." The cologne was another thing. Richard had worn the same Old Spice aftershave since our wedding day. The bathroom medicine cabinet always had 2 bottles, one in use, one backup. But suddenly there was a sleek black bottle of something called Noir Intensity, sitting next to his Old Spice. When I picked it up, it felt heavy, expensive. The price tag was still stuck to the bottom, $85. Richard, who complained when I spent $3 on name brand butter instead of store brand, had bought $85 cologne? His phone became an extension of his hand, the man who used to leave it in random places. The kitchen counter, his truck console, even once in the refrigerator, now kept it with him constantly. He'd take it to the bathroom, he'd sleep with it under his pillow, claiming he needed it for emergency calls. When it buzzed with texts, he'd angle the screen away from me, typing responses with a little smile playing at his lips. Once, when it rang during Jeopardy, he actually walked outside to answer it, standing in our backyard in the dark for 20 minutes. His wardrobe started changing too. New shirts appeared in his closet, fitted ones in colors he'd never worn before: burgundy, forest green, even one in lavender. Richard, who'd worn the same 5 white dress shirts in rotation for a decade, rotating them like uniforms. When I commented on the lavender shirt, he shrugged. Jennifer said I needed to modernize my look for client meetings. My daughter-in-law Jennifer later looked confused when I thanked her for helping Richard with his wardrobe. "I never said anything about his clothes," she said, then quickly changed the subject to Emma's preschool applications. That quick subject change, I should have paid more attention to that. I became an expert at explaining away the obvious, like a child covering their eyes and believing they're invisible. Every suspicious thing Richard did, I wrapped in a comfortable explanation and filed it away in the part of my mind reserved for things that couldn't possibly be true. The human heart is remarkably good at protecting itself from pain, and mine was working overtime. "Retirement jitters," I told Betty when she asked why Richard hadn't been at golf club for 3 weeks straight. "You know how men get when they're approaching 70. They start questioning everything, wondering about their legacy." I even laughed a little, stirring extra sugar into my coffee at the food bank's break room. "He's probably planning something special for our 45th anniversary. Remember how Tom acted before your surprise party? Men are terrible at keeping secrets." Betty didn't look convinced, but I kept talking, kept spinning my comfortable fiction. Richard was probably meeting with travel agents. Yes, that explained the secretive phone calls. He was finally planning that Alaskan cruise, or maybe something even grander. Paris? We'd always talked about Paris. I could picture him now, hunched over his computer after I went to bed, researching hotels on the Champs-Élysées, too proud to ask for help with the French pronunciation. When I found a receipt for lunch at Chez Laurent, that fancy French restaurant downtown, I actually felt validated. "See," I told myself, washing dishes with extra vigor. "He's developing a taste for French cuisine, definitely planning Paris." The receipt was for 2 people, but of course it was. He'd probably taken Marcus to discuss covering the business while we were away. That made perfect sense. Richard would want everything handled properly before a big trip. The new clothes were easy to explain too. We were approaching a milestone anniversary. Richard wanted to look good for all the photos we'd take. The lavender shirt? Well, men's fashion magazines were always saying men should wear more color. Richard must have read an article somewhere. Or maybe the saleswoman at the department store had convinced him. He'd always been susceptible to a convincing sales pitch. When Sarah called one evening and asked carefully, "Mom, is everything okay with you and Dad?" I was genuinely puzzled. "Of course, sweetheart. Why would you ask that?" There was a pause. Then she said something about Michael mentioning Dad seemed distracted lately. I laughed it off. "Your father's always distracted when he's planning something. Remember when he tried to build that gazebo as a surprise? He walked around in a fog for weeks." I even rationalized the physical changes. Richard had lost weight, 15 pounds without trying. "Well, that's wonderful," I told myself. "His doctor has been after him to lose weight for years." He was taking care of himself finally. The fact that he was suddenly doing push-ups in our bedroom every morning just meant he was taking his health seriously. We weren't young anymore. This was responsible behavior. One night, I woke at 2 a.m. to find Richard's side of the bed empty. I found him in his study, laptop glowing, clicking something closed as soon as I appeared. "Couldn't sleep," he muttered, reviewing contracts. I made him warm milk, kissed his balding head, and went back to bed, telling myself that successful men often worked odd hours. That's how they stayed successful. Looking back, I realize I was conducting a symphony of denial, each excuse a perfectly timed note in a song nobody else wanted to hear. But when you've spent 45 years building a life with someone, you don't want to believe it could all be a lie. You can't believe it, because if that's true, what does it say about you? Tuesday, October 15th, 2:47 p.m. I can tell you the exact moment my world tilted off its axis because I was staring at the microwave clock when I opened the credit card statement. I'd just come back from the food bank, my hands still smelling of the industrial soap we used there, when I grabbed the mail from our box. The envelope felt normal, thin, unremarkable, with our address showing through the little plastic window. Just another monthly statement to file away. I almost didn't open it. Richard usually handled the credit card bills, writing checks from his business account for anything work-related. But he'd been so distracted lately, and I noticed last month's statement still sitting in his study, unopened. Being helpful, I decided to reconcile everything, make his life a little easier. That's what good wives do, isn't it? They lighten the load. The kitchen was quiet except for the dishwasher's hum as I unfolded the statement. My reading glasses were upstairs, so I squinted at the small print, running my finger down the list of charges. Gas stations, hardware store, the usual restaurants, and then my finger stopped. Morrison Jewelry, $3,247.63. The numbers seemed to pulse on the page. Morrison Jewelry was the expensive place downtown, the one with the security guard at the door and the windows that looked more like museum displays than a store. In 45 years, Richard had bought me exactly 3 pieces of jewelry: my engagement ring, a pearl necklace for our 25th anniversary, and a pair of small gold hoops when Sarah was born. The man who insisted on buying generic cereal to save 30 cents had spent $3,000 at Morrison. My hand started shaking as I kept reading. The Grand Plaza Hotel, $230. October 1st, 2-hour p.m. transaction. Another charge, same hotel. October 8th, 2:15 p.m. Then October 10th. All afternoon charges. All on Tuesdays and Thursdays. My volunteering days. Emma days. The days Richard knew I'd be gone. Romano's Italian restaurant appeared 4 times. $127.43. $134.89. $126.50, $128.73. Each charge was for roughly the same amount. Too much for one person, not enough for a business dinner. I knew Romano's. Richard had taken me there for our 40th anniversary. The entrees were $40 each. Add wine, dessert, tip. These were intimate dinners for 2. I sat down hard on the kitchen stool, the statement trembling in my hands. My mind was doing gymnastics, trying to find innocent explanations. But the evidence was right there in black and white, as clear as our wedding vows had once been. The receipt times told a story. 2 p.m. hotel check-in, 6 p.m. dinner at Romano's. The jewelry purchase was dated September 28th, nowhere near our anniversary, my birthday, or Christmas. I grabbed my phone and pulled up our joint calendar. October 1st, Richard Riverside Project meeting. October 8th. Richard meeting with city planners. October 10th. Richard quarterly review with Marcus. Every single hotel charge corresponded with a supposed business meeting. My husband hadn't just lied, he'd created an elaborate schedule of deception. The room spun slightly. I gripped the counter. My knuckles white against the granite Richard had insisted we couldn't afford to replace last year. Through the window, I could see our neighbor, Mr. Peterson, mowing his lawn. The normal world continuing while mine crumbled on cream-colored credit card paper. I folded the statement carefully, creasing it along the exact same lines, as if keeping it neat could somehow contain the destruction it represented. Then I walked upstairs, placed it in my underwear drawer beneath the cotton panties Richard hadn't seen in years, and sat on our bed, the bed where he kissed my forehead each night. The bed where he was probably thinking about her. That evening, I served Richard his favorite pot roast, my hands steady despite the storm inside me. I waited until he'd had his first bite, watched him close his eyes in appreciation like he always did. Then I placed the credit card statement next to his plate, smoothing it flat against the tablecloth my mother had crocheted 50 years ago. "Maggie, what's this?" His voice was casual, but I saw his jaw tighten, the way it did when a contractor tried to overcharge him. "I was hoping you could tell me?" My voice sounded strange, like it was coming from someone else. Particularly the Morrison jewelry charge and the hotel visits on Tuesdays and Thursdays. The color drained from his face like water from a burst dam. Then came the anger, his default defense. "You're going through my statements now? Checking up on me like I'm some kind of criminal?" "Are you?" The words came out quiet, deadly. "Because honest men don't need hotel rooms at 2 p.m. Richard stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood. "This is ridiculous, Margaret. It's all business. The jewelry was a gift for a client's wife. The hotel has meeting rooms. You're being paranoid." "Then call them," I said, pushing the phone toward him. "Call the hotel right now and ask them about your meeting room reservation." He stared at the phone like it was a snake. "I don't have to prove anything to you." 45 years, Richard. You owe me the truth." His shoulders sagged. For a moment I saw the young man I'd married, uncertain and caught. Then his phone buzzed. The screen lit up with a text. "Diane. Can't wait for Thursday." The silence stretched between us like a taut wire. Richard reached for his phone, but I was faster, my hand slamming down on it. "Diane," I said, tasting the name like poison. "Your personal trainer, Diane?" His silence was all the confirmation I needed, but the worst was yet to come. The next morning, Michael arrived at 8 a.m., too early for a casual visit. I knew before he spoke that he was here to do damage control. My son, my firstborn, sat at my kitchen table and couldn't meet my eyes. Dad called me about the misunderstanding." "Misunderstanding?" My voice was ice. "Is that what we're calling adultery now?" Michael shifted uncomfortably. "Look, Dad's been going through a lot. You two have been distant for years. He met someone who makes him feel alive again. Diane is—" "You knew." The realization hit me like a physical blow. "You've known about this." The guilt on his face told me everything. "Mom, I didn't want to hurt you. Sarah and I thought it would blow over. Dad's had these phases before." Before. The room tilted. "Sarah knows too?" Michael reached for my hand, but I yanked it away. "We were trying to protect you. Dad deserves to be happy. You two were just existing, going through the motions. Maybe this is for the best." "The best?" I stood, my legs shaking. "I spent 45 years building this family. I gave up everything, my career, my dreams, my identity, to support your father and raise you. And you all decided what? That I was just existing? That I don't deserve loyalty? That I should be grateful to be deceived? Mom, please, get out." The words came from somewhere deep and primal. "Get out of my house." As Michael's car pulled away, I understood the real betrayal. It wasn't just Richard. My entire family had conspired to protect him, not me. I hadn't just lost my husband to another woman. I'd lost my children to the comfortable lie that my feelings, my sacrifice, my entire life simply didn't matter enough to defend. Sarah called 3 days later, supposedly to check on me, but I could hear the agenda in her voice like a discordant note in a familiar song. She rambled about the stress of modern life, how difficult it was for aging parents, how important it was to plan for the future. Then she let something slip that changed everything. "Mom, you know Dad's just trying to secure everyone's future before things get more difficult. The paperwork is almost complete anyway." "What paperwork, Sarah?" The pause was deafening. I thought Dad told you about the estate planning." I kept my voice level, playing the confused elderly mother they apparently thought I was. "Oh, that, yes, of course. Remind me what documents I signed? My memory isn't what it used to be." Sarah's relief was palpable through the phone. Just the standard stuff. The house deed transfer for tax purposes, the business restructuring, the power of attorney updates. Dad said you signed them last month during your foggy period. Foggy period? I remembered exactly what she meant. I'd had the flu in September, taken some strong medication that made me drowsy. Richard had brought me papers to sign, said they were insurance updates. I'd trusted him, signed where he pointed, then fallen back asleep. After hanging up, I drove straight to our bank. The assistant manager, Tracy, had known me for years. Her face went pale when I asked about our accounts. Mrs. Harrison, I thought you knew. Mr. Harrison moved most of the funds to new corporate accounts last month. For tax efficiency, he said. Show me everything. The numbers on her computer screen made my stomach lurch. Our joint savings, emptied. The retirement accounts transferred to a trust I didn't recognize. The checking account had just enough to cover monthly bills. Even my personal inheritance account, money from my mother's estate that had never been touched, was gone. Tracy, I whispered, the house deed. Can you check the property records? Her fingers flew across the keyboard. It's been transferred to Harrison Holdings, LLC. Richard is the sole member. You signed a quitclaim deed on September 15th. September 15th, the worst day of my flu. The day Richard had been so attentive, bringing me tea, fluffing my pillows, sliding papers in front of me with such concern. Just some insurance stuff, honey. Nothing important. I drove home in a daze, but my mind was racing. In my craft room, the one room Richard never entered, I pulled out the box where I kept important papers. Birth certificates, social security cards, and there, at the bottom, a business card I'd forgotten about. Marcus, Richard's new project manager. His cell number was written on the back. Marcus answered on the third ring. When I explained who I was and asked about Richard's recent late-night projects, his confusion was genuine. Mrs. Harrison, I've been trying to reach Richard for weeks. He hasn't been to the office since early September. I've been running everything myself. I figured he was sick or maybe taking an early retirement. Is everything okay? I made an excuse and hung up, the final pieces clicking into place. There were no late meetings, no Riverside emergency projects. Richard had been systematically dismantling our entire life while romancing his trainer, and our children were helping him do it. But why the elaborate deception? Why not just divorce me? Unless they needed me completely helpless first. Dead would be even better. No messy divorce, no asset disputes, just a grieving widower with a young girlfriend and a convenient fortune. The foggy period comment suddenly took on a sinister meaning. They weren't just stealing from me. They were building a case that I was losing my mind. That night, I found myself in Emma's room, the one place in the house that still felt pure. The walls were painted the soft yellow I'd chosen when Michael first told me they were expecting. Sunshine for my sunshine, I'd said, spending 3 days painting it myself while 7 months pregnant with back pain Richard never noticed. Now I sat on the small bed, holding the teddy bear I'd sewn for Emma's first birthday, its button eyes staring back at me with more warmth than I'd seen in my family's faces for months. The dam broke without warning. 45 years of suppressed exhaustion, overlooked pain, and swallowed pride came flooding out in ugly, body-shaking sobs. I pressed the bear against my face to muffle the sound, even though the house was empty. Even in breakdown, I was trying not to be a bother. Memories crashed over me in waves. Richard's face when I told him I was pregnant with Michael, how he'd spun me around our tiny apartment kitchen, promising me the world. I'd believed him. God help me, I'd believed every word. I remembered quitting my teaching job when Sarah was born premature, spending 4 months in the NICU, learning to feed her through tubes the width of coffee stirrers. Richard visited twice a week. Someone has to work, he'd said, while I lived on hospital cafeteria food and slept in chairs. The bear's fur was wet with tears as more memories surfaced. The night classes I'd abandoned to help Richard study for his contractor's license. I'd been 3 credits away from my master's degree in education, but Richard needed help with the business law sections. "Just 1 semester, Maggie, then you can go back." That was 28 years ago. The credits expired. The dream died quietly like everything else I'd wanted. I thought about his heart surgery 5 years ago. The cardiologist said Richard needed a bypass, and I'd transformed into a one-woman medical advocacy team. I'd slept in his hospital room for 2 weeks, fought insurance companies over coverage, learned to check his incisions for infection, managed his medications with military precision. I'd spoon-fed him when his hands shook from the pain medication, cleaned him when he couldn't make it to the bathroom, never once complaining about the indignity of it all. In sickness and in health, I'd whispered to him one night. He'd squeezed my hand and cried, promising he'd never forget what I'd done. But he had forgotten. They all had. I looked around Emma's room at the evidence of my love. The growth chart I'd painted by hand with tiny butterflies marking each inch. The bookshelf filled with stories I'd read so many times I could recite them from memory. The rocking chair where I'd held all 3 of my babies, and then my grandbabies, singing the same lullabies my mother had sung to me. What had it all been for? Every sacrifice, every swallowed dream, every time I'd chosen their happiness over mine, what did it amount to? I was being erased like pencil marks, my entire existence deemed inconvenient to their new plans. 45 years reduced to paperwork to be filed away. My reflection in Emma's mirror was a stranger, red-eyed, gray-haired, shoulders bowed from carrying everyone else's dreams. When had I become this ghost? When had the vibrant young teacher who'd wanted to change the world become this disposable woman? The sobs came harder, and I didn't try to stop them. I cried until my ribs ached, until the bear was soaked, until I had nothing left. Empty. That's what I was. An empty vessel they'd drained dry and were now discarding. At 3 a.m. something shifted. I was still sitting in Emma's room, the soaked teddy bear in my lap, when I caught my reflection again in the mirror. But this time, something was different. The woman staring back at me wasn't a ghost. She was still there, under the gray hair and tear-stained cheeks. The same woman who'd worked 3 jobs to put herself through college. The same woman who'd delivered Sarah on the bathroom floor when she came too fast for the hospital, cutting the cord herself with sewing scissors sterilized in boiling water. I stood up slowly, my knees protesting after hours on the floor. Walking to the mirror, I really looked at myself. These hands that Richard now found so disposable had built his empire with him. These eyes he couldn't meet anymore had spent thousands of nights watching over our children's fevers. This body he'd traded for a younger model had carried and delivered his legacy. "You stupid woman," I said to my reflection. But for the first time, it wasn't self-pity. It was anger. Clean, sharp, clarifying anger. "You're Margaret Ann Sullivan Harrison. Your father was a coal miner who died at 42, and your mother raised 9 children alone. You come from women who survived the Depression, who buried children and kept going, who built lives from nothing but determination and spite." The rage felt like electricity in my veins. They thought I was weak because I was kind. They thought I was stupid because I was trusting. They thought I was disposable because I was old. They had no idea who they were dealing with. I walked to Richard's study, no longer tiptoeing in my own home. His laptop sat on the desk, the one he thought I didn't know how to use. I'd let him believe that the same way I'd let him believe I didn't understand the business. But who did he think kept his books for 15 years before he could afford an accountant? Who wrote his first proposals, edited his contracts, sweet-talked angry clients when his temper cost him jobs? The password was pathetically easy, our anniversary date. Of course it was. Even while planning to destroy me, he kept up the charade. I opened his email, his bank accounts, his business files. Everything was there, including emails to Diane with subject lines like, "Almost free" and "Just a little longer, baby." One email made my blood run cold, from Michael to Richard. Mom's memory issues are documented now. 3 neighbors mentioned she's been forgetful. Sarah got her to admit she couldn't remember signing the papers. The medical evaluation is scheduled for November. November. Next month. They were planning to have me declared incompetent. I sat back in Richard's chair, the leather creaking under my weight. They'd made one crucial mistake in their perfect plan. They'd assumed I would crumble, that I would accept their betrayal and disappear quietly into whatever corner they'd prepared for me. They'd forgotten that I was the woman who'd fought off a burglar with a cast-iron skillet when Richard was traveling, who'd faced down a corrupt building inspector trying to shake down our business, who'd delivered a baby on a bathroom floor and lived to tell about it. I pulled out my phone and started making notes. Lawyers, forensic accountants, private investigators, every contact I'd made over 45 years of being Richard Harrison's invisible wife. Every secret I'd kept, every favor I was owed, every piece of dirt I'd politely ignored. If they wanted a war, they were going to get one. And I had something they didn't expect. 45 years of ammunition and nothing left to lose. My revenge began with a phone call at 6 a.m. to Patricia Chen, the forensic accountant who'd uncovered embezzlement at Sacred Heart 3 years ago. I'd served on the church board with her, watched her methodically destroy a corrupt treasurer who'd stolen $200,000 from the building fund. Patricia was brilliant, ruthless, and most importantly, she despised men who financially abused their wives. Margaret? It's early. Is everything okay? Patricia, I need your help. Richard is hiding assets, and I need to find them all. There was a pause, then, I'll clear my morning. Bring everything. Next, I called Tony Garducci in Florida, Richard's first business partner, the one who'd mysteriously retired 20 years ago after a supposed buyout. Tony had always liked me, called me the conscience of Harrison Construction. More importantly, Tony knew where the bodies were buried. Literally. There were construction, projects with corners cut, inspections that were suspiciously passed, permits that appeared overnight. Maggie? Jesus, it's been years. How's that bastard Richard treating you? Not well, Tony. I need to know about the Riverside Mall Foundation. The real story. His laugh was bitter. Finally ready to hear it? I've got documents, sweetheart. Kept them all these years just in case. The recording app on my phone became my constant companion. Minnesota was a one-party consent state. I could legally record any conversation I was part of. I recorded Richard talking to Diane on the phone, his voice soft and promising as he discussed their future. I recorded Michael casually mentioning the plan to have me evaluated for dementia. I recorded Sarah discussing how they'd divide my jewelry, the pieces I'd inherited from my grandmother. I started playing a role, the confused elderly woman they expected me to be. When Richard came home, I'd occasionally forget where I put things, then find them immediately, just enough to make him comfortable, to make him think his plan was working. I even baked his favorite cookies, served his meals with a vacant smile, let him kiss my forehead each night while my skin crawled. During the days, I was someone else entirely. I hired a private investigator, James Morrison, a former cop who specialized in adultery cases. Within a week, he had photographs of Richard and Diane at hotels, restaurants, even looking at condos together. The real estate agent, when approached, was happy to confirm they were seeking a fresh start love nest for after his situation was resolved. The master stroke came when I visited our safety deposit box. Richard didn't know I'd kept my own key. Inside, along with our marriage certificate and the children's birth certificates, were the original incorporation papers for Harrison Construction, the ones clearly showing my maiden name as co-founder, my mother's inheritance as the initial capital investment. Richard had forged documents to remove me from the business, but he couldn't forge away the originals he'd forgotten existed. I made copies of everything. Emails, bank statements, forged documents, real documents, photographs. Patricia Chen created a detailed financial report showing the systematic asset stripping. Tony overnight had sworn affidavits about Richard's business practices, including a certain apartment building that had tragically collapsed in 2004, killing 2 people. The investigation had been closed, but Tony had photos of the substandard materials Richard had used. By late October, I had 3 safety deposit boxes at different banks, each containing complete sets of evidence. I had a lawyer, Catherine Brennan, who specialized in financial abuse cases and was famous for leaving cheating husbands penniless. I had a plan, and I had a funeral to attend. November 3rd arrived gray and drizzling. Perfect funeral weather for a man who wasn't dead. I dressed carefully in the black. Dress Richard had bought me 10 years ago, the one he said made me look dignified. My hands were steady as I pinned my mother's pearl brooch to the collar. The woman in the mirror looked like a grieving widow. No one would suspect she'd spent the previous night on the phone with federal investigators. The house filled with the scent of coffee and store-bought pastries. I'd refused to cook for this charade. Michael arrived first, wearing his best suit and a face of practiced sorrow. He hugged me stiffly, whispering, "Remember, Mom, just get through today. Everything will be better soon." If only he knew how right he was. Sarah flew in from Denver that morning, her husband David trailing behind, looking uncomfortable. She kissed my cheek, her lips cold, her eyes already calculating. "The lawyer will be here at noon," she murmured, "to read Dad's will and handle the estate transfers. Just sign where he tells you, Mom. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." The living room slowly filled with Richard's business associates and a few neighbors who'd heard about the tragic loss. They offered condolences I accepted with a vacant smile, playing the shocked widow to perfection. Betty from the food bank squeezed my hand, genuine tears in her eyes. "So sudden," she kept saying. "A heart attack in Canada. Who would have thought?" At 11:30, Diane arrived. She wore a conservative gray suit, her blonde hair pulled back, trying to look appropriately somber. Michael introduced her as Dad's business associate who's been invaluable during this difficult time. She had the audacity to take my hand, her perfume, something young and floral, making me nauseous. "I'm so sorry for your loss, Mrs. Harrison," she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "Richard spoke of you often." "I'm sure he did," I replied, my smile never wavering. Behind Diane, I saw the first of my invited guests arriving. Detective Morrison entered quietly, standing near the door. He nodded at me slightly, the signal that everything was in place. 2 FBI agents, introduced as family friends from Washington, took positions near the windows. The news crew I'd tipped off about a major insurance fraud story was parked outside, cameras ready. They thought they were here to document a massive scandal. They had no idea how massive it would be. Jennifer, Michael's wife, was corralling the children in the corner, trying to keep them quiet. Emma ran to me, throwing her small arms around my legs. "Gigi, why is everyone sad?" I smoothed her hair, this innocent child who had no idea her family was built on lies. The lawyer, Kenneth Marsh, arrived at 11:55, his briefcase heavy with fraudulent documents. He sat up at the dining room table, arranging papers with the efficiency of someone who'd done this before. How many other wives had he helped dispose of? "Should we begin?" Kenneth asked, checking his watch. "There's quite a bit to cover, and I understand the cremation is scheduled for 2 p.m. "Oh, there won't be a cremation," I said pleasantly. "It's rather difficult to cremate someone who's still alive." The room went silent. Michael's coffee cup rattled against its saucer. Sarah's face drained of color. Diane took a step backward, bumping into Detective Morrison, who smiled at her like a cat who'd cornered a mouse. And then, right on schedule, the front door opened. Richard walked through the door at exactly noon, very much alive, wearing the same burgundy shirt he'd bought for Diane. He was actually whistling until he saw the room full of people supposedly mourning his death. The silence lasted maybe 3 seconds, then chaos. "Richard?" Betty gasped, clutching her chest. "But the funeral? You were dead." Richard's eyes found mine across the room. I smiled and raised my coffee cup in a mock toast. "Surprised, dear. Though I believe I'm the one who should be surprised, aren't I?" "Mom, we can explain," Michael started, but I held up my hand. No need, sweetheart. I already know everything. I pulled out my phone, connection already established to the Bluetooth speaker I'd hidden earlier. In fact, why don't we all listen together? Richard's voice filled the room, recorded from 3 nights ago. Once Margaret's committed, we can finally move forward. The stupid woman actually thinks she has dementia. She signed everything without question. Diane's giggle followed. How long until we can get married? 6 months after she's institutionalized, can't seem too eager. The room erupted. Neighbors gasped. Betty dropped her coffee. But I wasn't done. The next recording was Michael and Sarah, planning my medical evaluation, discussing how they'd convinced the doctor I was incompetent, laughing about how I'd been losing things they'd been hiding. "Turn it off," Sarah screamed, lunging for my phone. Detective Morrison stepped forward, blocking her path. "I wouldn't do that, ma'am. You're already facing conspiracy charges." "Conspiracy?" Richard's voice cracked. "For what? Family planning?" "Insurance fraud for starters," FBI agent Phillips announced, showing his badge. "Filing a false death certificate. Wire fraud for the international transfers. And that's just the federal charges." He looked at Richard with disgust. "Though I have to say, planning to institutionalize your wife to steal her inheritance? That's a new low, even for us." The news crew had pushed their way inside, cameras rolling. The reporter, a young woman with perfect hair and a shark's instincts, thrust a microphone at Richard. "Mr. Harrison, is it true you faked your death to avoid splitting assets in a divorce?" "Get that camera out of my face," Richard roared, but the damage was done. His angry, very alive face would be on the evening news across 3 states. Kenneth Marsh, the lawyer, tried to slip toward the door, but found his way blocked by the second FBI agent. "Mr. Marsh, we'll need those documents, all of them." The best revelation was yet to come. Detective Morrison stepped forward, holding up a photograph. "Mr. Harrison, we've reopened the Riverside Mall collapse investigation. Your former partner, Tony Garducci, has provided compelling evidence about substandard materials." Richard's face went from red to gray. "Tony's lying. He's bitter about the buyout." "The buyout where you threatened his family?" I asked sweetly. "Oh, yes, Tony told me about that too. He kept recordings, Richard. 20 years of recordings." Diane was edging toward the back door, but Jennifer, of all people, blocked her path. "You're not going anywhere," my daughter-in-law said firmly. "Emma doesn't need to see her grandfather's mistress running away like a coward." Sarah was crying, mascara running down her cheeks. "Mom, please, we didn't mean—" "Didn't mean what?" I asked. "To steal my inheritance? To declare me incompetent? To help your father bury me alive in some nursing home while he played house with his trainer?" I looked at my children with a mixture of pity and disgust. "You meant every bit of it. You just didn't mean to get caught." The FBI agents began reading rights. The cameras kept rolling, and Richard Harrison, the man who'd built an empire on my back and tried to bury me beneath it, was led away in handcuffs, very much alive and finally truly dead to me. The trials made national news. The funeral fraud, they called it, and Richard's angry face became a meme about toxic marriages. He was convicted on 17 federal charges, including wire fraud, insurance fraud, and conspiracy. The judge, a woman who'd gone through her own bitter divorce, sentenced him to 12 years without possibility of early release. When they led him away, Richard looked at me one last time, his eyes pleading. I turned away. 45 years of looking at that face was enough. The murder investigation into the Riverside Mall collapse took longer, but Tony's evidence was damning. 2 families finally got justice for their lost loved ones. Richard received an additional 25 years for manslaughter and criminal negligence. He'll die in prison, and I can't find it in myself to feel sorry for him. Michael was disbarred and sentenced to 5 years for conspiracy and fraud. His wife Jennifer filed for divorce the day after his conviction. She brought Emma to visit me last week, apologizing for not speaking up sooner. "I suspected something was wrong," she admitted, "but Michael convinced me you were really declining." I forgave her. She'd been manipulated too, and she'd stood up when it counted. Sarah's husband David left her before the trial even started. Turns out she'd been hiding assets from him too. The apple didn't fall far from the tree. She got 18 months and 3 years probation. She writes me letters from prison, begging for forgiveness. I return them unopened, just like Richard's. Diane fled the state but was arrested at Dallas Airport trying to board a flight to Mexico. The engagement ring Richard bought her with my money was confiscated as evidence. She served 6 months for fraud and lost her personal training certification. Last I heard, she was working at a mall kiosk selling phone cases. Kenneth Marsh, the crooked lawyer, was disbarred and served 2 years. Several other families came forward afterward, claiming he'd helped their spouses hide assets during divorces. He lost everything, which seemed fitting for someone who'd built a career on helping others take everything from their partners. As for me, Catherine Brennan, my lawyer, was brilliant. Not only did I recover all the stolen assets, but the court awarded me complete ownership of Harrison Construction. The business Richard built on my mother's money, sustained by my labor, supported by my sacrifices, was finally, legally, completely mine. I sold it for $8 million to Marcus, Richard's young project manager. He'd kept the business running during all the chaos and deserved it. With the money, I established the Margaret Harrison Foundation for Financial Abuse Survivors, specifically helping women over 60 who've been economically betrayed by their families. We've helped 43 women in just 6 months. I kept the house, my grandmother's house, and had it legally transferred back to my maiden name, Margaret Ann Sullivan. I converted Richard's study into an art studio and finally started painting again, something I'd abandoned when Michael was born. My paintings sell at a local gallery now. They're nothing special, but they're mine. Emma stays with me every Thursday. We bake cookies, read stories, and I teach her to paint. She doesn't know the full story yet, but someday I'll teach her the most important lesson. Never let anyone convince you that your worth is determined by what you can do for them. Betty and I still volunteer at the food bank. She says I look 10 years younger, that there's light in my eyes again. "You're glowing, Maggie," she told me yesterday. "Like you've been reborn." In a way, I have been. The Margaret who lived for others died the night I discovered that fake corpse. The woman who rose from those ashes lives for herself, finally, at 68 years old, free. This morning, I stood in my garden planting the David Austin roses Richard always said were too much work. "They're fussy, Maggie," he'd complain. "They need too much attention. Plant something easier." But as I pressed the soil around their roots, I realized that was our entire marriage in one metaphor. I was supposed to be the easy one, requiring no maintenance, no attention, thriving on neglect while making everything around me beautiful. The roses will be magnificent this spring. They'll require care. Yes, pruning, feeding, vigilant protection from pests, but the blooms they'll produce will stop people in their tracks. Sometimes the things worth having are the ones that demand we show up for them, tend to them, refuse to let them be convenient. Sometimes we're the roses, not the forgotten perennials in the back corner. Looking back, the betrayal was actually a gift wrapped in barbed wire. It forced me to see that I'd been complicit in my own disappearance. Every time I'd said, "it's fine," when it wasn't, every dream I'd postponed for when things settle down, every moment I'd chosen their comfort over my truth, I'd been teaching them that I didn't matter. Richard and my children didn't suddenly decide I was disposable. I'd spent 45 years showing them I was. The saddest part isn't what they tried to do to me. It's that they genuinely believed I deserved it. In their minds, a woman who gives everything must not value what she has to give. A mother who sacrifices without complaint must not feel the pain of sacrifice. A wife who stands in the shadows must prefer the darkness. They mistook my kindness for weakness, my selflessness for worthlessness, my love for something they were entitled to, rather than blessed to receive. But here's what I've learned at 68. after losing everything I thought mattered and finding everything that actually does. Family isn't about blood or legal documents or shared last names. It's about respect, genuine care, and seeing each other's full humanity. The people who truly love you don't need you to shrink yourself to make room for them. They create space for you to expand. Greed is a peculiar poison. It doesn't just want money or property, it wants to justify itself. That's why Richard couldn't just divorce me. He needed me to be incompetent, needed me to be failing, needed me to be the villain in his story of self-discovery. Admitting he was leaving a good woman for a younger one was too ordinary, too obviously wrong. But leaving a woman with dementia for a chance at happiness? That made him a tragic hero instead of a common cheater. The foundation I started has shown me I'm not unique. Every week, another woman over 60 walks through our doors with the same story. Decades of devotion repaid with disposal. Their children side with the money. Their friends fade away. Society tells them they're too old to start over. But you know what? We're not starting over. We're finally starting. So to everyone watching, especially those who see themselves in my story, remember this. Your worth isn't determined by those who take you for granted, but by your own recognition of your value. It's never too late to demand respect. It's never too late to choose yourself. And sometimes, the family that betrays you is just clearing space for the life you were meant to live. What would you have done in my situation? Would you have fought back like I did? Or would you have walked away quietly? Have you ever discovered that the people you trusted most were capable of betrayal? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and remember, you're never too old, too invested, or too far gone to reclaim your life.